In a small village in the Carpathian Mountains, there exists a phenomenon that geneticists have whispered about in hushed tones for decades, but have been too terrified to publicly acknowledge. On a moonless night in March 2017, two identical twin brothers married two identical twin sisters in a ceremony that seemed innocent, even charming, a double wedding that the local community celebrated with joy and laughter. But what nobody at that wedding understood, what even the couples themselves didn't realize until years later, was that they had just set in motion a genetic cascade that would produce children so unusual, so scientifically impossible, that when the DNA results finally came back, 3 separate laboratories refused to release the findings, claiming the data must be corrupted. These children, born from twin bloodlines colliding, are not just cousins. They are not just siblings. They are something that exists in a gray zone that human genetics has no proper terminology for. Something that challenges our understanding of identity, family, and what it means to be an individual. The parents thought they were creating a beautiful extended family. Instead, they may have opened a door that nature intended to keep locked forever. If you're fascinated by genetic mysteries that science can't fully explain, by stories that blur the line between miracle and nightmare, by folklore that turns out to be rooted in terrifying truth, then you absolutely need to subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because we explore the darkest corners of human genetics and the secrets that families hide for generations. Smash that like button if you're ready to have everything you thought you knew about twins and genetics completely shattered, and comment below whether you think what happened to these children is a gift or a curse. Now let's dive into a story so strange, so unsettling, that it reads like ancient folklore but happened in our modern world. The village is called Vremya, a name that means time in the local Slavic dialect, and it sits in a valley so remote that even today, with satellite internet and modern roads, it feels like a place where time moves differently, where old superstitions still hold power, and where the boundary between the natural and supernatural feels dangerously thin. Vremya has a population of about 800 people, and it has a reputation throughout the region as a place of twins. Not just occasional twins, but an unusually high rate of twin births that has persisted for as long as anyone can remember, going back centuries according to local records. The twin brothers were named Dmitry and Alexei Volkov, born 28 minutes apart in the winter of 1985, so identical that even their own mother sometimes couldn't tell them apart. The twin sisters were Katya and Irina Petrov, born in the spring of 1987, mirror images of each other with the same dark hair, the same green eyes, the same graceful way of moving that made people stop and stare when they walked down the village streets. The 4 of them grew up in Vremya, attending the same small school, playing in the same forests, swimming in the same rivers, and it seemed almost inevitable that they would pair off as they grew older. Dmitry fell in love with Katya first, or at least he was the first to admit it, when they were both 16 years old. Within months, Alexei and Irina had also become a couple, and the village elders nodded knowingly, saying this was how it was meant to be, that twin souls recognized each other across the boundaries of individual identity. The 4 of them were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences, sharing private jokes that only they understood, creating a tight unit that outsiders found both beautiful and slightly unsettling. They married in that double ceremony in 2017, Dmitry to Katya and Alexei to Irina, in the village's small Orthodox church decorated with wildflowers and candles. The priest who performed the ceremony, Father Vasily, was a man who had served Vremya for 40 years, and he later told investigators that he had felt a strange chill during the ceremony, a moment of profound unease that he couldn't explain, as if he were consecrating something that shouldn't be consecrated. But he dismissed the feeling as nerves and completed the ceremony, binding the two couples in matrimony. The couples built houses next to each other on the edge of Vremya, so close that their back porches almost touched, sharing a large garden between them. They lived communally in many ways, eating meals together, sharing household tasks, raising money through a small farming operation that they ran jointly. To outsiders, they seemed like the happiest people imaginable, and perhaps they were. But there were things about their relationship that they kept private, aspects of their life together that the village whispered about but never discussed openly. Katya became pregnant first, in the fall of 2018, and within 2 months, Irina was also pregnant. The village celebrated, preparing for the arrival of the next generation, and the two women went through their pregnancies together, attending the same doctor in a nearby town, experiencing the same symptoms at almost the same times, their bodies synchronized in the mysterious way that twins often are. They gave birth within 3 days of each other in June 2019, Katya delivering a son they named Nikolai, and Irina delivering a son they named Mikhail. The babies were remarkably similar, even for cousins. They had the same weight and length at birth, the same distinctive birthmark on their left shoulder blades, the same unusual pattern of eye color that shifted between blue and green depending on the light. The village doctor, an elderly woman named Dr. Sokolov, who had delivered half the children in Vremya over her long career, examined both babies and made a comment that nobody paid much attention to at the time. She said that the boys looked less like cousins and more like brothers, possibly even twins, and that she had never seen two babies from different mothers who were quite so identical. As Nikolai and Mikhail grew, the similarity only intensified. They reached every developmental milestone at exactly the same time, spoke their first words on the same day, took their first steps within hours of each other. The four parents found this delightful, documenting every moment, taking photographs that showed the boys dressed identically, playing together, seeming to communicate in a language that only they understood. The village elders watched with a mixture of pride and something that looked like concern. And some of the oldest residents began to whisper about ancient stories, about what happens when twin bloodlines merge. There is a folklore tradition in that region, going back centuries, about twin-born children and the power they supposedly carry. The old stories speak of twins as being partially outside normal reality, sharing a soul that exists across two bodies, able to see things that ordinary people cannot see. And when twin-born adults produce children, according to the darkest versions of these stories, those children become something called echo souls, beings who exist simultaneously in multiple states, who carry the memories of ancestors, who can blur the boundaries between self and other. The village's oldest resident, a woman named Baba Yaga, yes, actually named after the folklore witch, who was 97 years old, and claimed to remember stories told by her grandmother, who had been born in the 1800s, visited the two families when the boys were about 6 months old. She examined both babies carefully, and then she told the parents something that disturbed them greatly. She said that according to the old knowledge, these boys were not really two separate people, but were instead two manifestations of the same soul, that their genetic connection was so profound that they existed in a state that normal human beings were never meant to achieve. The parents dismissed this as superstitious nonsense, the ramblings of a very old woman who still believed in folk magic and fairy tales. But Baba Yaga's words stayed with them, especially as the boys continued to develop in ways that seemed to go beyond normal twin-like behavior. Nikolai and Mikhail didn't just act similar, they seemed to share experiences. When one boy hurt himself, the other would cry at the same moment, even if they were in separate rooms. When one got sick, the other would develop symptoms within hours. They had nightmares on the same nights and woke up describing identical dream scenarios that they couldn't possibly have coordinated. By the time the boys were 2 years old, both couples had produced second children, and this time the births were even more synchronized. Katya and Irina gave birth on the exact same day, both delivering daughters. Katya's daughter named Sofia and Irina's daughter named Elena. The odds of identical twin sisters married to identical twin brothers giving birth on the same day were astronomical. But it happened, and once again the babies were so similar that they could have been twins themselves. Dr. Sokolov, now deeply concerned, suggested that the families consider genetic testing for the children. She explained that while the children were legally cousins, their genetic relationship might be much closer than that due to the parents being identical twins. The families were hesitant, worried about what they might find, but they eventually agreed, and blood samples from all 4 children were sent to a genetic testing facility in Moscow. The results took 6 weeks to come back, and when they did, they included a note from the head geneticist requesting a conference call with the families. Dr. Sokolov participated in that call, and she later described it as one of the most disturbing conversations of her medical career. The geneticist, a doctor, Volkov, no relation to the family, it's a common name, explained that the test results were so unusual that he had initially thought there must have been a sample mix-up at the laboratory. Here is what the DNA testing revealed. Nikolai and Mikhail, the 2 boys born to different mothers and different fathers, shared approximately 50% of their DNA, the same amount that typical full siblings share. Despite being technically cousins, they were genetically indistinguishable from brothers. The same was true for Sofia and Elena. The children were not cousins in any meaningful biological sense. They were genetic siblings, born to different mothers but carrying DNA combinations that made them as closely related as if they had come from the same parents. Dr. Volkov explained the mechanism behind this. Because Dmitry and Alexei are identical twins, they share 100% of their DNA, making them genetically the same person. Because Katya and Irina are identical twins, they also share 100% of their DNA. Therefore, when these couples have children, those children are receiving DNA from the same genetic sources, regardless of which specific parent contributes it. Dmitry's sperm carries the same genetic information as Alexei's sperm. Katya's eggs carry the same genetic information as Irina's eggs. The children are cousins by family tree, but siblings by genetics. But Dr. Volkov's explanation didn't stop there, and this is where the story moves from fascinating genetic trivia into something much darker and more mysterious. He explained that the level of genetic similarity between the children went beyond what should be theoretically possible even given the twin parents. There were markers in the children's DNA that suggested what he called genetic resonance, patterns that appeared to be amplified rather than just inherited, as if the twin bloodlines hadn't just combined, but had somehow reinforced each other, creating a genetic profile that was more concentrated, more intense, than normal human genetics should produce. Dr. Volkov said that in his 25 years of genetic research, he had never seen anything quite like it. The children's DNA showed what he called mirror patterns, sections where the genetic code seemed to be doubled back on itself in ways that shouldn't occur naturally. He said it was as if the twin bloodlines had created some kind of genetic echo chamber, where traits weren't just passed down, but were amplified and reflected between the children. He strongly recommended that the families bring the children to Moscow for more extensive testing and observation, suggesting that this was a unique genetic phenomenon that could contribute significantly to scientific understanding of heredity and twin genetics. But he also, and this is crucial, warned the families that there might be unexpected consequences to this unusual genetic configuration, particularly as the children grew older and their neurological systems fully developed. The families declined to bring the children to Moscow. They were frightened by Dr. Volkov's warnings, disturbed by the implications of what he was telling them, and they made the decision to raise their children quietly in Vremya, away from scientific scrutiny and public attention. They swore Dr. Sokolov to secrecy, and they tried to continue their lives as normally as possible, but normal was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As the children grew from toddlers into young kids, the phenomenon that Baba Yaga had warned about became impossible to ignore. Nikolai and Mikhail didn't just act like brothers or even like regular twins. They demonstrated a level of connection that seemed to defy normal neurological explanation. They could complete each other's sentences even when they hadn't been in the same room. They could describe events that only one of them had witnessed. They seemed to share memories, to the point where asking one boy about his day would get you information about what the other boy had experienced miles away. The same was true for Sofia and Elena. The two girls were so synchronized that teachers at the village school, which they started attending at age 5, couldn't keep them separated. If they tried to put the girls in different classrooms, both girls would become severely distressed, experiencing panic attacks and physical symptoms like rapid heartbeat and difficulty breathing. When kept together, they functioned perfectly well, but they operated more like a single consciousness distributed across two bodies than like two individual children. By the time the children were 7 years old, the situation had escalated to the point where the 4 parents couldn't ignore it anymore. The children had started speaking in unison, saying the same sentences at the same time, even when they were supposedly thinking about different things. They had begun to refer to themselves in ways that blurred individual identity. Nikolai saying things like "we remember when Mikhail saw the bird," treating his cousin's memories as his own. The girls had developed what could only be described as a shared language, speaking in rapid phrases that switched between them mid-sentence, creating conversations that were impossible to follow because it wasn't clear where one girl's thoughts ended and the other's began. Dr. Sokolov, now deeply alarmed, contacted Dr. Volkov in Moscow without the family's permission, explaining what was happening with the children. Dr. Volkov, in turn, contacted colleagues in neuroscience and psychology, and together they developed a theory that was so radical, so far outside mainstream science, that Dr. Volkov risked his professional reputation by even proposing it. His theory was this: the extreme genetic similarity between the children, combined with their constant proximity and the mirroring effect of having genetically identical parents, had created a neurological phenomenon where the children's developing brains had essentially networked with each other. Dr. Volkov hypothesized that the children's mirror neurons, the neurons responsible for empathy and understanding others' actions, had become so hyperactive and so finely tuned to each other's genetic signatures that the normal boundaries between self and other had partially dissolved. In simpler terms, Dr. Volkov was suggesting that the children had developed a form of shared consciousness, not through any mystical or supernatural mechanism, but through an extreme expression of natural neurological processes pushed to a level that human beings were never meant to experience. The twin parents had, inadvertently, created children whose sense of individual identity was fundamentally different from normal human identity. Children who existed in a state between being separate individuals and being parts of a larger whole. This theory, when Dr. Volkov presented it at a closed conference of geneticists and neuroscientists, was met with intense skepticism and even hostility. Most scientists dismissed it as impossible, arguing that consciousness doesn't work that way. that genetics can't create the kind of neurological networking that Dr. Volkov was proposing. But a small group of researchers, particularly those who studied twins and those who worked on consciousness and identity, found the theory disturbingly plausible, at least as a hypothesis worth investigating. A team of researchers traveled to Vremya to study the children, with the family's reluctant permission. They conducted extensive testing, brain scans, psychological evaluations, observational studies. What they found was documented in a series of papers that were published in obscure journals. Papers that most mainstream scientists ignored, but which created a small underground following among researchers interested in the outer boundaries of human neurology. The brain scans showed that the children's neural patterns, the electrical activity in their brains, demonstrated unusual synchronization when the children were in proximity to each other. When Nikolai and Mikhail were in the same room, their brain waves would begin to align, showing similar patterns of activity at the same times. The same was true for Sofia and Elena. The researchers described it as neurological entrainment taken to an extreme level, where the children's brains were literally synchronizing their activity. This psychological testing revealed that the children had difficulty with tasks that required them to distinguish their own thoughts and experiences from those of their genetic sibling. When asked to describe something that only Nikolai had witnessed, for example, both Nikolai and Mikhail would sometimes claim the memory as their own, and neither could explain why they both remembered something that only one had experienced. The children weren't lying or confused. They genuinely seemed to share a pool of memories and experiences that both could access. Most disturbing to the researchers were the results of separation experiments. When the children were separated by significant distances, more than a few miles, they experienced severe psychological and physiological distress. Their heart rates would increase, they would become anxious and agitated, and they would report feeling like part of themselves was missing. In one particularly disturbing incident, when Mikhail was taken to a town 30 miles away for a medical appointment, Nikolai, who had remained in Vremya with no knowledge of his cousin's trip, suddenly collapsed at approximately the same time that Mikhail was accidentally injured at the doctor's office. Nikolai described feeling a sharp pain in his arm at the exact location where Mikhail had been hurt. The researchers were divided on how to interpret these findings. Some argued that what they were seeing was an extreme version of normal twin empathy, heightened by the genetic factors but not fundamentally different from well-documented twin connections. Others argued that the children represented something genuinely new, a form of human consciousness that had never been studied before because the specific genetic circumstances had never occurred before, or at least had never been documented. The debate became more urgent when the families shared something they had been keeping secret. There were 3 other families in Vremya's history where identical twin siblings had married identical twin siblings, dating back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. The families had kept records, passed down through generations, documenting what had happened to the children from those unions. And according to those records, the pattern was consistent across time. The historical records described children who were inseparable, who seemed to share thoughts and feelings, who could not function independently. They described children who spoke in unison, who developed their own private languages, who were treated by the village as being neither fully individual nor fully merged, existing in some intermediate state. The records also documented that these children invariably faced tragic outcomes. Many died young, in their teens or 20s, often within days of each other despite having no obvious illness. Those who lived longer tended to become increasingly isolated, unable to form relationships with people outside their genetic sibling pair, unable to function in normal society. One particularly detailed account from 1923 described a pair of boys born to twin parents who had become so inseparable that they eventually refused to sleep in separate beds, refused to be in different rooms, and finally refused to acknowledge themselves as two people, insisting that they were one person who happened to have two bodies. The village priest at the time had tried to intervene, attempting to separate them and force them to develop independent identities, but the boys had become violent and self-destructive, ultimately dying in what the records carefully described as a shared tragedy when they were 19 years old. These historical accounts terrified the modern families, and they made a collective decision to stop participating in any further scientific studies. They withdrew from public life, homeschooling the children to avoid outside scrutiny, trying to manage the situation on their own. But managing was becoming increasingly difficult as the children grew older and the phenomenon intensified. By the time Nikolai and Mikhail were 10 years old, they had developed what could only be described as a merged identity. They would answer to either name interchangeably. They would complete tasks together that neither could complete alone, as if their individual cognitive abilities combined into something greater than either possessed separately. They had developed an accelerated intelligence, scoring far above average on standardized tests. But this intelligence seemed to be distributed between them rather than possessed by each individually. Sophia and Elena showed the same pattern, perhaps even more pronounced because they had always been more emotionally expressive than the boys. The girls had developed an artistic ability that was extraordinary, creating paintings and drawings that art experts who saw them described as far beyond what children their age should be capable of. But the girls couldn't explain their artistic process, couldn't describe how they created their works, because the creative process seemed to happen between them, in some space that neither occupied individually. The families sought help from various sources, speaking cautiously with psychologists, with other twin parents, with religious leaders. The responses ranged from dismissive, "It's just normal twin bonding," to concern the children need to develop independence, to frightened, "What you're describing shouldn't be possible." Father Vasily, the priest who had married the parents, visited the families and spent time with the children. After observing them for several days, he told the parents something that shook them deeply. He said that in his theological studies, he had read about early Christian debates on the nature of the soul, and that there had been a minority position among some theologians that the soul could exist in states other than the traditional one, soul per body model. He said that observing these children, he found himself believing that they might represent such a state, that perhaps their souls, if souls existed, had somehow been woven together in a way that was neither separation nor merger, but something in between. He said this not as scientific speculation, but as a spiritual observation, and he admitted that he didn't know whether what he was seeing was a miracle or a tragedy. The turning point came when the children were 12 years old. Katya and Irina, the mothers, had arranged for both boys to attend a special program for gifted children in a city about 100 miles from Vremya. This was the first time Nikolai and Mikhail would be separated for an extended period, and the families hoped that the separation might help the boys develop more independent identities. Nikolai was sent to the program, while Mikhail remained in Vremya. The experiment lasted exactly 4 days before it had to be abandoned. Nikolai, separated from Mikhail, underwent what psychiatrists later described as a profound dissociative episode. He became unable to speak in complete sentences, unable to perform basic tasks, unable to recognize people he knew well. He reported feeling like half of himself was missing, like he was trying to function with only part of a brain. Meanwhile, back in Vremya, Mikhail experienced the exact same symptoms at the exact same times. Both boys were hospitalized, both showing signs of severe, psychological trauma, despite no obvious external cause. When the boys were reunited, they recovered almost immediately, their symptoms disappearing within hours of being back in proximity to each other. The doctors who treated them had no medical explanation for what had happened. The boys were physically healthy. Their brain scans showed no abnormalities, but they had clearly experienced something catastrophic when separated. After that incident, the families gave up any attempt to encourage independence or separation. They accepted that Nikolai and Mikhail, and Sophia and Elena, would need to remain together. That attempting to separate them was not just impractical, but potentially dangerous. They redesigned their lives around this reality, making plans for the children's futures that assumed they would function as pairs rather than as individuals. As I record this story, the children are now 15 years old, and the situation has stabilized into a strange equilibrium. Nikolai and Mikhail are homeschooled together, pursuing their education as a unit, planning to attend university together in a program that will allow them to essentially function as a single student. Sophia and Elena have become somewhat famous locally as artists, creating works under a shared name, their paintings sought after by collectors who find them beautiful and disturbing in equal measure. Families have found a way to live with what their decision to marry Win created, but they carry an enormous burden of guilt and uncertainty. They wonder constantly whether what they see in their children is a miracle or a curse, whether the children are experiencing a form of connection that most humans can only dream of, or whether they have been robbed of something fundamental about individual human existence. Dr. Volkov continues to monitor the children from a distance, having agreed to respect the family's desire for privacy while maintaining scientific documentation of this unprecedented case. He has written, in unpublished notes, that the children represent the furthest extent of human genetic similarity outside of being literal clones, and that their neurological development has taken a path that was theoretically possible, but has never been observed before. He wonders what will happen as the children reach adulthood, whether they will be able to form romantic relationships, whether they will want to have children of their own, whether the pattern might repeat itself in another generation. The folklore that Baba Yaga spoke of, the ancient stories about echo souls and merged destinies, has taken on new significance in Vremya. The village elders now speak openly about the children, treating them with a mixture of respect and caution, acknowledging that something unusual has happened that connects their modern lives to ancient beliefs about the nature of identity and soul. Some villagers see the children as blessed, as representing a form of human connection that transcends normal limitations. Others see them as warnings, as evidence that there are boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, genetic configurations that humans were never meant to achieve. The scientific community remains deeply divided on what the Vremya children represent. Most mainstream researchers continue to dismiss the case as either exaggerated or explainable through normal twin psychology. But a growing minority of neuroscientists, geneticists, and consciousness researchers believe that the children represent something genuinely new, a natural experiment in human consciousness that occurred not in a laboratory, but through the accident of twin bloodlines colliding. There are ethical questions that nobody knows how to answer. If future identical twins considering marrying other identical twins asked for advice, what should they be told? Is what happened to these children a good thing, a bad thing, or something that can't be judged by those categories? Do the children have a right to their unusual form of consciousness? Or did they have a right to normal individual development that was taken from them by their parents' choice to marry Win? The children themselves, when asked how they feel about their situation, give answers that are both reassuring and deeply unsettling. They say they can't imagine existing any other way, that the idea of being completely separate individuals feels wrong to them, like it would be a form of loneliness too profound to bear. They say they are happy, that they feel complete, that they have something precious that other people don't have, but they also acknowledge that they are different, that they can't relate to normal people in normal ways, that they exist in a reality that is fundamentally unlike the reality that most humans experience. What happened in Vremya when twin bloodlines collided may be a miracle, a demonstration of human consciousness's ability to adapt and merge in ways we never imagined possible. Or it may be a nightmare, a warning about genetic configurations that strip away individual identity and create beings who can never fully function in normal human society. Perhaps it is both, simultaneously, a demonstration that the concepts of miracle and nightmare are inadequate for describing phenomena that exist beyond normal human experience. The children continue to grow, to develop, to live their unusual lives in a village that has learned to accept them. And somewhere in that remote valley in the Carpathian Mountains, the question remains unanswered. When twin bloodlines collide, when genetics creates connections that nature never intended, are the results an evolution of human consciousness or a cautionary tale about boundaries that should never be crossed? The answer, like the children's own sense of identity, may exist in a space between categories, in a gray zone where human language and human understanding reach their limits, and we are left only with wonder, fear, and the humbling recognition that we understand far less about consciousness and identity than we thought we did. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.